It was late past midnight in the pediatric ward when Theodore sat beside his daughter's bed and began to sing. His voice was low and rough, the kind worn down by years of night shifts and swallowed grief. And the song was old, something from another era entirely. Out in the corridor, Eleanor stopped walking. She had been mid-stride, tablet in hand, reviewing the quarterly facility report. She stopped, as if a wire inside her had been cut. Just a few bars. That was all it took. Her eyes went red without warning, and she stood very still in that fluorescent hallway while something she had spent 3 years burying came rushing back up through the dark. The man behind that door did not know her. He did not know what that melody meant. He did not know that the last person who had sung those words had loved her more than she had ever known how to receive, and was gone. Theodore James Marsh was 34 years old, and had the look of a man who had quietly accepted a harder life than he deserved. He worked the night janitorial shift at Mercy General Hospital, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, mopping floors, emptying biohazard bins, scrubbing the bathrooms on floors 3 through 6. He was methodical and invisible in the way that night workers often are, moving through those bright corridors while the rest of the world slept, nodding to the charge nurses, staying out of the way of the doctors. He did not complain. He never had. His daughter, Chloe, was 6 years old and had her mother's eyes wide and dark and quick with expression. Her mother had left when Chloe was 14 months old, a departure that arrived with no real explanation and no forwarding address, and Theodore had raised the girl entirely on his own since then. They lived in a studio apartment on the east side of the city, a room he had made warm by sheer force of intention, a string of paper stars taped across the window, a bookshelf stuffed with picture books and a few dog-eared paperbacks, a second-hand rug with a pattern of blue fish that Chloe had chosen herself from the thrift store when she was 4. It was small. It was enough. They had a routine, and they had each other, and on the nights he worked, his neighbor Mrs. Callahan would sleep on the couch to be there if Chloe needed anything. He paid her in homemade bread, because it was the only currency he had to offer that she would accept. Chloe had been born with a congenital heart defect, a condition that had been monitored since infancy, managed with medication, watched carefully by a cardiologist Theodore could barely afford to see. The surgery that could correct it permanently cost more than Theodore would earn in 4 years. He knew the number by heart. He kept it written on a piece of paper inside his wallet, not as a reminder of what was impossible, but as a kind of promise to himself that he was still working toward it. He had a savings account. It was growing slowly. He had not stopped adding to it, even in the months when he was eating beans and rice 4 nights a week to make the deposit happen. Eleanor Voss was 32 years old, and if you had read about her in a financial magazine, which you might have, since she appeared in them regularly, you would have learned that she had taken her late husband's mid-sized pharmaceutical distribution firm and transformed it, in the space of 3 years, into a vertically integrated healthcare conglomerate with 4 hospitals, 11 outpatient clinics, and a valuation that had crossed the billion-dollar threshold 18 months ago. You would have read that she was decisive, visionary, and formidably disciplined. What the magazines did not print was that she had not laughed, genuinely laughed since the accident, that she kept her late husband's photograph in her desk drawer rather than on top of it, because looking at it cost too much, that she had learned, in the years since his death, to keep herself moving at a pace that left no room for stillness, because stillness was where the grief lived. His name had been Daniel. He had died in a car accident 3 years ago on a Tuesday evening in November, driving home from a hospital visit. He had been sick himself, a minor cardiac procedure, the kind considered routine, and the surgeon had sent him home with instructions to rest. He had called Eleanor from the car. She had been in a board meeting and had let it go to voicemail. She had not listened to that voicemail for a long time. When she finally did, his voice was warm and unhurried, and he had said he was on his way home and that he loved her. And then he had sung a few bars of the song he always sang when he was happy, the old American folk standard her father had taught him years ago, and then the call ended. And 40 minutes later, a police officer had appeared at her office door. Chloe's condition worsened on a Wednesday in early February, faster than any of the previous scares and with a severity that frightened the night nurses into immediate action. Theodore was 3 floors down when his phone lit up with the call, and by the time he reached the pediatric cardiac unit, his daughter was already connected to a monitor, her small chest rising and falling, with a labor that made his own lungs tighten. The attending cardiologist spoke carefully. The valve was compromising. The medication was no longer sufficient. Surgery needed to happen within 72 hours, or the risk profile became significantly worse. Theodore listened to all of it, standing very still in the hallway, his mop still in his hand, because he had not thought to leave it somewhere. He nodded at the right moments. He thanked the doctor. Then he went to the family consultation room, sat down in a plastic chair, and looked at his hands for a long time. He went to the billing office first thing that morning, before his shift ended. He explained the situation clearly and without embellishment. The administrator was not unkind. She told him about the financial assistance programs, the application timelines, the possibility of an emergency review. The timelines were weeks, not days. Theodore nodded again. He went home, put Chloe's favorite blanket from the apartment into a bag along with her stuffed rabbit and 3 picture books, brought them back to her room, and arranged them around her carefully. Then he sat beside her bed, and when she was almost asleep, he began to sing. It was the song he always sang. He had learned it from an old man in the park years ago, a gentle widower named Arthur who used to sit on the same bench every morning, and who had told Theodore it was the best song he knew for keeping a frightened heart quiet. Theodore had believed him. He still believed him. Eleanor had come to Mercy General that night for a standard operational review, the kind she conducted quarterly, moving through the facility at midnight when the volume was low and the staff candid. She moved through the floors with her assistant, Marcus, 2 paces behind her, and she asked questions and received answers and made notes and gave no indication of what she thought about any of it. She was efficient. She was, as always, contained. She heard it before she saw it. The door to room 412 was cracked open, and the sound came through softly, a man's voice, rough at the edges, carrying a melody she recognized from somewhere deep and wordless, somewhere before language. She stopped. Marcus stopped behind her. The song continued, unhurried, low, each phrase given its full length, and Eleanor stood in the corridor while something she had sealed off and submerged came loose and drifted upward, her tablet lowered to her side. She did not move. She did not breathe normally. When her eyes filled, she pressed them closed and stood very still until she was certain that no sound had escaped her. Then she walked to the end of the corridor and stood near the window until she was composed again. Marcus said nothing. He had been with her long enough to know when not to speak. She did not tell herself why she asked Marcus to pull the file on the patient in room 412. She framed it, internally, as due diligence a patient whose procedure timing might be affected by the facility's current surgical scheduling. It was not a lie she examined closely. The file on Theodore Marsh arrived on her desk the following afternoon. Marcus had been thorough, as he always was. No insurance. A savings account that held $11,200, a significant sum, clearly assembled with tremendous discipline, but less than 1/3 of what the procedure cost. No family listed as emergency contacts except the child herself. No assistance applications on file. Employment record at Mercy General, 4 years. No disciplinary incidents. Consistent performance reviews. A note from his supervisor that described him as the most reliable member of the night crew. She looked at the file for a long time. Then she closed it and went back to her calendar. But she returned to the 4th floor that night. And the night after that, she told herself she was reviewing nursing staffing patterns, which was partially true. She stood at different points along the corridor, never close enough to be visible from the doorway, and she watched. She watched Theodore come in at the start of her visits, still in his work clothes, move the chair to exactly the same position beside his daughter's bed, check the monitors with his eyes, not with medical knowledge, but with a father's furious attention, and then settle in. He always talked to Chloe first. She could not hear the words, but she could see the quality of it, the way he leaned toward the girl and made the small room feel, from the outside, like the warmest place in the building. And then, when Chloe's eyes went heavy, he would begin to sing. Eleanor noticed that it was always the same song. She noticed that his voice did not perform, it did not sell it or shape it for effect. He sang it the way a person breathes, automatically, because it was simply the thing he did when the person he loved most needed to feel safe. And every time she heard it, something moved in her chest that she had been determined, for 3 years, not to let move. The song was, "The Water is Wide." Daniel had loved it with an uncomplicated joy that she had always found slightly baffling. He was not a sentimental man in most respects, was precise and even-tempered and clear-headed about almost everything. But that song undid him in some pleasant way. He had sung it badly, enthusiastically, in the car. He had sung it softly to himself when he was reading. He had sung it in the hospital room the morning of his procedure, sitting on the edge of the bed in the paper gown, and she had stood near the window and thought, with the particular cruelty of hindsight, that she had been more interested in her phone than in the sound of his voice. She recognized this. She did not let herself sit with it. The harder question arrived on the 4th night, hovering above all the practical ones. What was she doing? She had resources that could resolve Theodore Marsh's problem in the time it took Marcus to make 3 phone calls. The surgery cost was a rounding error in the facility's operating budget. She could authorize a financial assistance grant. She could restructure the billing timeline. She could do a dozen things, and none of them would require her to explain anything to anyone or acknowledge any of what she had been standing in corridors feeling in the dark. But she did not move, because something in her, something she was not proud of, wanted to keep this exactly as it was. The man who sang the song her husband had loved, sitting beside his daughter's bed each night, unaware that she existed. There was a terrible purity to it. She was afraid that if she intervened, something would shift, and the thing that the song gave her this thin, complicated thread back to Daniel would change into something else, something ordinary, something that would cost her the only peace she had found in 3 years. She knew this was wrong. She knew it with the same clarity with which she knew most things. The child needed surgery. A man who had done nothing wrong was running out of time, and she was standing in a hallway grieving for herself. The flashback arrived without invitation, the way the real ones always did, not as a smooth, cinematic sequence, but as a series of sensory fragments, the paper gown rustling, the sound of monitors she had not yet learned to decode. Daniel's voice carrying that melody, slightly off-key, relaxed in a way that infuriated her memory now because she had not understood then that it was the last morning she would have to be infuriated by it. The officer at the door. The voicemail she had listened to, finally, sitting on the floor of her closet at 3 a.m, 11 weeks after the funeral, because she had needed to hear him one more time, even though she had known exactly what it would cost her. She had not cried in front of anyone since the memorial service. She had decided, in some quiet and unspoken way, that grief was a private matter, and that composure was the form of respect she owed to the people around her. She had honored this decision faithfully. She had not broken it. But standing in the corridor outside room 412 on the 4th night, she admitted something to herself that she had been refusing to admit. She had not healed. She had managed. And management and healing were not the same thing. Chloe's condition turned critical on a Thursday morning. Theodore was finishing his shift when the cardiologist found him in the hallway. Not a Page's, the family conversation, but a finds him in person conversation, which told him everything before a word was spoken. The valve was failing faster than projected. The surgery could not wait another 48 hours. The window for optimal intervention was narrowing to a matter of hours, not days. Theodore set down the mop bucket. He put his hands in his pockets. He said in a very level voice, "What do I need to do?" The answer, stripped to its functional core, was, "Produce $238,000 before noon, or sign a consent form acknowledging the additional risk of delayed procedure." He had $11,000. He had a truck worth perhaps $4,000 if someone was having a generous day. He had a few hundred in checking. He made 14 calls in the next 2 hours. Friends, a distant cousin, his former supervisor at the warehouse job he had held before Mercy General. He raised another $3,900 in promises, some of which he believed. It was not close. He went back to Chloe's room. She was awake, pale, the monitor above her head showing the numbers he could now read well enough to understand. He sat beside her and took her hand, and smiled at her with a steadiness that required more from him than anything he had ever done in his life. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "We're going to be fine." He believed this not because the evidence supported it, but because he refused to allow it to be otherwise. He sat beside her until she drifted back to sleep, and then he put his forehead against the rail of the bed and stayed that way for a long time. Then he straightened up. He smoothed his daughter's hair, and he began to sing, softly, the same song, the words coming from somewhere that did not require him to be functional or brave or even present, just habitual, just a father, just a voice her small body had learned to associate with safety. Eleanor was in her office on the 7th floor when Marcus appeared in her doorway and said, very carefully, "The patient in room 412. The surgical team is asking about scheduling. There's a billing hold." She knew what he was telling her. She had known for 2 days that this was coming, the way you know a dam is cracking before the water shows through. She sat at her desk for a moment longer, her pen still in her hand, looking at the surface in front of her, as if she were calculating something. Then she stood up. She did not go to the room. She did not go to the billing office. She called Marcus from the hallway outside her office and gave him 4 instructions in sequence, in a tone that left no room for any of them to be optional. Transfer of funds anonymous, routed through the facility's charitable care account with a donor notation that said, "Only private." Surgical scheduling the primary suite, the best cardiac team in the building, 7 o'clock that evening. A notation on the file that the donor had requested complete anonymity, and that no staff member was to share any information about the funding source with the patient or his family. And a 4th instruction, quieter, which was that Marcus was to ensure that she was not in the building when the patient was informed. She drove home for the first time before midnight, in longer than she could remember. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before she could make herself go inside. The surgical team assembled at 6:45. Theodore sat in the waiting area outside the cardiac suite with his hands folded in his lap, his work boots still on his feet, his eyes fixed on the middle distance. A nurse had told him that the billing situation had been resolved. A charitable fund had covered the full cost, and Theodore had said, "I'm sorry," and the nurse had repeated it. And Theodore had said nothing further because there was nothing in him in that moment that was capable of processing the information. He had simply nodded and sat back down. He sang, very softly, to himself, in the waiting room. Not for comfort, not even consciously. Just because the song was there, and had always been there, and he did not know what else to do with his hands and his voice while his daughter's heart was being repaired. The lead surgeon emerged at 9:14, pulling her cap from her head. Theodore was on his feet before she reached him. She told him the procedure had gone well better than projected. The valve repair was clean. Chloe would be in recovery for several hours, and then transferred back to a monitored pediatric room. She would need follow-up care, rest, a modified routine for some weeks. But the structural correction was complete. Theodore stood with his hands at his sides and his eyes closed for a long moment. Then he sat down on the floor of the waiting room, not dramatically, not in a collapse, but deliberately, as if his legs had simply decided the work was done. He put his face in his hands. He had not cried in front of Chloe, not once in the past 4 days. He had cried twice in the truck, alone, driving home to get her rabbit. But now, in the waiting room, with the surgeon already gone and no one watching, he cried fully. The kind that comes from the deepest and oldest part of a person, the part that does not perform anything for anyone. He stayed on that floor for several minutes. Then he wiped his face on his sleeve, stood up, and went to the coffee machine to get something to keep him awake for the rest of the night. Chloe recovered with the specific determination of children who have not yet learned to be uncertain about their own resilience. By the second day, she was asking for her picture books. By the fourth, she was telling the nurses the plots of stories in extensive detail. By the end of the first week, the cardiologist was describing her progress as exceptional, and Theodore had resumed his night shifts, sleeping in the chair beside her bed during the days and working the floors at night with the same steady, unhurried reliability that had characterized his 4 years at Mercy General. But the question of who had paid for the surgery did not leave him. He was a man who did not like debts he could not see clearly. He went to the billing office and asked. The administrator said charitable fund and referred him to a policy document. He went to the patient services office and asked again. A different administrator said anonymous donor, and the words had a practiced quality, a briefed quality, that told him the answer had been prepared in advance. He thanked her and left. He began to pay attention differently. He had worked in this building for 4 years and had the particular knowledge of someone who spent his nights in its corridors. While everyone else was focused elsewhere, he knew which administrators came in early, which doctors ate in the break room at 2 in the morning, which offices on the upper floors stayed lit until dawn. He noticed, now, that the lights on the 7th floor, the executive suite, were on every night. He noticed that a black car arrived and departed at irregular hours. He noticed Marcus, the executive assistant, whom he had seen dozens of times without registering, moving through the building with the focused purpose of someone managing a very particular agenda. It was a phlebotomist named Grace, who worked the overnight blood draws on floors 4 and 5, and had no particular reason to be discreet about things she did not know were sensitive, who told him, in the break room on a Tuesday night, that Mrs. Voss had been coming to the 4th floor a lot lately. That she had seemed different, Grace said, in a way Grace could not quite name, less like she was inspecting something and more like she was visiting something. Theodore thanked Grace, finished his coffee, and went back to work. He did not go to the 7th floor that night, but he thought about it for the rest of his shift, moving through the corridors with the mop, turning the information over quietly. A billionaire widow who owned the hospital. Anonymous. The song. He had not put it together completely, but he had most of the pieces. He did not go to the 7th floor until Chloe was discharged. He waited, deliberately, because whatever he was going to say to Eleanor Voss, if it was Eleanor Voss, he wanted to say it without the weight of obligation pressing on every word. He went on a Tuesday evening, in his own clothes, not his work uniform, which felt important in a way he could not entirely articulate. Marcus, to his credit, did not pretend he was unexpected. Eleanor's office was large and deliberately spare. A desk, a work table, 2 chairs, windows that looked out over the city at an angle that showed its lights without sentimentality. She was standing when Theodore entered, which meant she had seen him on the monitor and had chosen not to be seated, which told him something. She was very composed. She was the most composed person he had encountered in his life. He said, "I know it was you." She said, "I don't know what you're referring to." The denial was immediate and practiced and entirely unconvincing, and she seemed to know it was unconvincing even as she delivered it, because something in her face shifted slightly, tightening at the corners. Theodore sat down in one of the chairs without being invited. He folded his hands in his lap. He looked at her for a long moment, not confrontationally, not with the heat of someone demanding an accounting, but with the particular attention of a man who had spent years watching people in hallways and rooms while they did not know they were being watched. He said, "She's home now. The surgery worked. She's been telling her stuffed rabbit everything that happened in the hospital, in chronological order, for the past 4 days." He paused. "I don't know how to thank you for that. I've been trying to figure out what you say to someone who did what you did, and I don't have the words. So I just wanted to tell you she's okay." Eleanor said nothing. She was looking out the window. "There's something else," Theodore said. He settled back slightly in the chair. "The song, the one I sing to her. I learned it from a man named Arthur, years ago, Arthur Hayes. He used to sit on a bench in Hollingsworth Park every morning, and I'd see him when I was cutting through on the way to a job. One morning he taught it to me. He said it was for frightened hearts. He paused. He never told me why he knew it so well, but he talked about his daughter sometimes. I remember he missed her very much. Eleanor turned from the window. Her father's name had been Arthur Hayes. He had died 4 years ago, the year before Daniel, and she had been with him when he went, had been there in a way she had not been with Daniel, present and clear-eyed, holding his hand. He had loved that song. He had sung it to her when she was small, and she had taught it to Daniel, and Daniel had made it his own in the uncomplicated way he did everything. She had not known her father had been teaching it to strangers in the park. She had not known he had kept sitting on that bench in his last years, being himself for whoever happened to be nearby. The fullness of it, the specific, impossible chain of it, moved through her all at once, and there was nowhere left to put it. No available container, no management strategy that applied. Theodore watched her face change. He watched the composure extraordinary, 3-year titanium composure give way at the seams, quietly, without drama, the way a sky changes color before rain. She sat down. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. And then Eleanor Voss, who had not cried in front of another person since the memorial service 3 years ago, cried without making a sound. Theodore did not say anything. He had the wisdom of a man who had spent 4 years moving through rooms where people were having the worst moments of their lives, and he knew that some things did not require a response, only a witness. He sat in the chair and let her grieve without comment, and outside the windows the city continued its indifferent, luminous business. After some time, she said, "He never told me he still went to that park." "He went every morning," Theodore said. "Right up until he couldn't anymore, I think." She nodded. She dried her face with the back of her hand in a gesture so unguarded it seemed to belong to a younger person, someone before the years of discipline. "He was a good man," she said. "Yes," Theodore said. He was. The weeks that followed were quiet, in the way that things become quiet after a long tension releases. Chloe went home and got better, and made her stuffed rabbit a hospital bed out of a shoebox, which she considered medically appropriate. Theodore returned to his shifts, to the blue fish rug and the paper stars, to the slow and reliable rhythm that had always been the architecture of his life. Eleanor did not disappear. She came to the 4th floor less frequently, but she came and not on inspections, not with Marcus and a tablet, but on her own, in the early evening, with a book she was not really reading. She would stop by Chloe's room once or twice, while the girl was still a patient, and then, after the discharge, she stopped by the break room where Theodore took his meal at 2 in the morning, and they would sit across from each other with coffee and talk about nothing consequential about Arthur sometimes, about the park, about the city at night, and the particular texture of hospitals when the volume drops and the corridors get long and quiet. She did not apologize for what she had withheld in those early days. He did not ask her to. They both understood, without discussing it, that she had been trying to protect something that needed to be let go, and that she had let it go, and that this was its own kind of resolution. Chloe, who had no interest in the adult complications of the situation and an extremely direct emotional vocabulary, decided immediately that Eleanor was someone she liked. She told her at length about the hospital, the nurses, the specific texture of the recovery room jello, the rabbit's shoebox infirmary. She asked Eleanor, with the unfiltered curiosity of a 6-year-old, why she looked sad sometimes when she was sitting still. Eleanor had said, carefully, that sometimes she missed people who were gone. Chloe had considered this with the gravity it deserved. Then she said, "When I miss my dad when he's at work, I sing the song. It helps." Eleanor looked at the girl for a long time. "Does it?" she said. "Yes," said Chloe. And she sang it off-key, enthusiastic, every word correct, right there in the break room, at 2:15 in the morning. Eleanor sat very still through the whole of it. When it was over, she did not cry. She smiled, a small, real, unprepared smile, the kind that appears before the composure can catch it. It was not a transformation. These things do not happen cleanly or completely, not in real life, not in the lives of people who have earned their damage the hard way. Eleanor did not stop being private, or precise, or armored in ways that would take years yet to fully examine. Theodore did not stop being cautious with trust, or quiet about his own needs, or prone to carrying things alone past the point of wisdom. Chloe continued to be exactly and entirely herself, which was sufficient to anchor both of them. But something had opened, not dramatically, not with declaration just open, the way a window opens and the air changes without announcement. There was an evening in late March, several weeks after the discharge, when Eleanor came by the break room and Theodore was already there, and Chloe was with him a rare late stay, approved by Mrs. Callahan, who had a cold, and Chloe had fallen asleep in the chair with her head against her father's arm, the rabbit wedged between them. Eleanor stood in the doorway. The fluorescent lights were doing what fluorescent lights do, which is to flatten everything, and yet the room did not look flat. Theodore looked up when he heard her, and made a small gesture at the available chair that contained no pressure and no expectation. She sat down. After a moment, Theodore began to sing, softly enough not to wake his daughter. The same song, as always. The words were about water and love and the difficulty of crossing from one shore to another when there is no boat and no bridge, the particular human predicament of wanting to reach something that seems very far away. Eleanor listened. The city moved outside the window. Chloe breathed the deep, untroubled breath of a child whose heart had been fixed and who had no reason to believe it would fail her again. This time, Eleanor did not cry. She sat quietly in the chair, her coffee warm between her hands, and she let the song come and go without fighting it. There was no performing of composure here, no management, no strategy. There was only the room, and the child, and the man with the roughened voice, and the melody her father had given to a stranger in a park on a winter morning because he had known, with the gentle certainty of the very old, that good things should be passed along while there is still time. She was still sitting there when the song ended. She did not leave quickly, and when she finally stood to go, she looked at Theodore for a moment, not with the distance she had carried for 3 years, not with the careful absence she had perfected, but with the simple, direct regard of someone who has decided to be present in a place that frightened them and found that it was survivable. Theodore nodded at her. Chloe slept. The paper stars in the apartment across the city caught the light from the street below, turning slowly in the draft from the cracked window, and the night continued, as nights do without ceremony.